Hi, this is Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today I chat with Lena Raine, composer most celebrated for her work on Celeste and now the upcoming Chicory. Before that, she worked at ArenaNet, and we talk at great length about not just her music and her career, but specifically that at ArenaNet she came from a background in design and all the distinct life lessons and advantages that brings her in her work as a composer today. It was a fantastic chat. She is a fantastic composer, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Okay, we are officially recording with Lena Raine. Hi.
Hello.
You are the first person I'm talking to on what feels optimistically like the kind of tail end of the pandemic. I think we are, while we are not, in a world that resembles January of 2020 quite yet, it feels like we're getting there rapidly day by day, but nonetheless, grateful to be. I'm officially declaring that you are you're christening the new era.
Ooh.
This is my first glimpse into the new horizons of reality.
Well, no pressure.
You just be you.
That's me.
How are you? How are you doing? Does it feel like that for you? Is that just my delusion, or does it feel like there's reason for?
There's definitely some degree of day-to-day normalcy coming back. At least I'm fully vaccinated now, so I've got that in my favor.
Has that enabled you or empowered you or like emboldened you? Probably is the best word to go out and do things that maybe 6 months ago would have fell off the table.
Sure, within caution, but I went out with my sister to celebrate Norwegian Independence Day on Monday, and dating this podcast already. But yeah, we actually went to a place that had food that was indoors, and it was very trying to feel comfortable. I was like, is this okay? Is this okay that we're doing this? But it was really interesting to finally kind of emerge into the greater world again.
Did that feeling of it's almost like muscle memory coming back slowly in a way, the kind of social graces of interacting in person and not on a little screen? Did it, by the time it was done, did it feel like you were kind of back to normal, or do you feel like I'm going to need a few of these?
Getting there, kind of, wading in 1 foot at a time.
I asked because I have a friend who went to a restaurant recently, and it was the first time she had similarly in well over a year. And she's always had kind of issues with her immune system. She's definitely the quintessential example of somebody that was extra cautious due to being a bit immunocompromised. And so for her, it was kind of a climactic step to go to a restaurant. But she said after about 5 minutes, she thought, or maybe even less, she almost immediately felt like it kind of just feels like normal life almost immediately. She was really relieved to discover that it wasn't going to be this long kind of coming out of the cave feeling from her.
Yeah. I think the main thing for me is making sure that I'm in situations where I know other people around me are being safe and all that, and as long as that's happening, hey, we can actually kind of do stuff within reason outside. But yeah, for now it's just kind of things here and there, and I was really glad to get a chance to see family again. I'll eventually see my grandma, and she's been hanging in there. She's 90 something years old, 90,
Wow.
95, 96. Yeah,
Incredible.
But she's been hanging in there through the whole pandemic. She's had to be just by herself, in her retirement community, and
Where on the planet is she?
Just in Washington as well. Here in Seattle, or
Oh,
I'm in Seattle, so she's also
does that
in
mean you grew
Washington.
up around there?
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
That's nice then, at least to not have to, figure out on top of everything else logistics of traveling somewhere with.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose if you're vaccinated, you have the majority of what most places would potentially be looking for, but it's certainly, especially travel to Europe right now, has extra complications that we didn't have before, even for the fully vaccinated. So I guess that's convenient. And she's been okay. I know that retirement homes or nursing homes and those kinds of places have been a very mixed bag of horror stories and success stories. So I gather she's done well.
Well, luckily it's like a retirement community, so it's kind of like a gated community with lots of distance and space and stuff. So she basically has like an apartment / condo there, and has been able to just kind of fend for herself. And people have helped her get groceries and all that. So yeah,
that's good.
It's been good, and I'll be really glad to see her again soon.
Has she gotten vaccinated as well?
Yes, she's fully vaccinated. Also, she was the first in our family.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah,
95.
Probably.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I know that's been, it's one of those, that same friend actually that I was just mentioning who went to a restaurant, her grandmother, who I think right now is okay, had a bit of a health scare recently. And she's from Australia. And so she felt very marooned and very kind of exiled to be able to do anything about it. And that was, I know, really difficult. So, I'm very happy for you that it's kind of in your backyard, at least, so to speak, to be able to jump at moment's notice. It's amazing how much this whole thing has cast a new appreciation on simple things like that are really not complicated, but somehow became so.
Totally.
Well, how has this all affected? I got a million questions that I have. Well, that's probably not the right way to phrase it, because I don't ever do these in the form of an interview. There's just things that I haven't had occasion to ask you before, and I like that I get to document my act of asking, because we've only really ever done the one event together.
Yeah, the last GDC that happened.
No.
There's still one. There was one after that I was actually in Japan, I think.
Was it GDC? We did a panel together.
Did we? Oh, right. Was it a PAX thing?
Yeah, okay, yeah. I was like, where in the hell was that? I could picture the room we were in.
Right,
but I couldn't picture what event that was. PAX.
That was PAX. That was, yeah.
Right.
And that was the last PAX before the pandemic, I think.
May have been. I was at a PAX in Boston literally a year ago when the pandemic started, because it was it was a known thing. People went to
PAX. That was the last one, and then
was that the one? Was
lockdown.
That where? So
I wasn't in Boston. We were at the previous year, so at the end of the middle of 2019. Seattle. Yeah.
Got it. Wow, so that was already we're rapidly approaching 2 years ago that was happened. That doesn't even seem possible, especially because
unreal.
Wasn't Chicory kind of unveiled then and there?
It was
very recently around there.
Right, it was on the show floor. We had our debut demo then. So yeah, I brought you to the booth and we actually checked it out together.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm trying to remember, wasn't that essentially the first time anyone, period, was seeing the game? Like was it had it been?
Yes, you're right. Actually, that was when we did the Kickstarter. That was when we put out the demo and the demo EP and everything. So yeah, that was the unveiling for that game. That was
2 years.
2 years, what? Yeah. I was confused because I mentioned Chicory to you at the GDC before that PAX, before it was even a known thing.
Oh, right. I don't know that I knew. Did you call it Chicory? It's
no.
possible that I didn't know what I don't think until this moment.
I was speaking very vaguely about it because it was a drawing game with with a dog and a paintbrush,
Yeah, it's all clicking together now. That I never made that connection because I didn't file it away. My brain sort of stored it, I guess, in the wrong spot because I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. Well, that means that this has been, solidly 3+ years. I'm gathering then that,
Mm.
which is about right. At least in my experience, that tends to be kind of the magic number that a lot of these end up at.
Yeah,
Anywhere
totally.
from 2 to 4. How are you feeling about it? I've got all kinds of thoughts. I've had a chance to listen to some of it. I wasn't
Awesome.
prepared when you sent me the album that it was going to be approximately 5 million tracks of music.
There's a ton
So
of music in there.
yeah, I wish I could say I've heard it all, but I've
Hmm.
certainly heard enough to get that wonderful sense of this is definitely you, and yet it
Mm.
also contains things that I've never heard you do, which is always the most magical combo for me because it's the novel and fresh and the familiar kind of nostalgia is not the right word, but almost like comfort food.
Yeah.
But how are you feeling about it? How now that we're on the cusp of its release and we're barreling towards that day?
Yeah, it's exciting. It's really something that like I've been looking forward to for a long time because I mean even just within the span of this year, like it still feels like the year is starting, even though it's, mid-May. Uh, but um but yeah, like I had finished writing the music around the end of the year last year. And so this, the beginning of this year was kind of just wrapping up all the loose ends, and then it's kind of been
Mm,
in the process of getting translated into different languages and ported because we're going to be launching on PlayStation, all that stuff. So it's been a whole like post production wind up to actually releasing the game, and so it's been kind of like working on other projects, but then just kind of like this sustained intensity of like this is ready, it's going to come out eventually. And I really want
I,
people to check it out because I'm so excited for it.
how what is the full scope of your work? Just hearing you mention them localizing obviously shows that you're pretty tight with the team. But where do the edges of your contributions lie? Like, for
Mm,
example, you're obviously writing the music, but
yeah.
are you the kind of one-stop shop for all things audio? Like, are you basically delivering them FMOD or WISE sessions or something? Are you collaborating internally with somebody? What? And part two of my question for you to seamlessly and elegantly bake into your answer is um, is whatever you're about to say representative of the norm for you, or
Mm.
has it been an outlier?
So to cover the first part, I'm working with a sound designer, M, who's works for a Shell in the Pit. It's a lovely sound design group up in Vancouver, and they did work on Wandersong and Night in the Woods,
Mm,
a bunch of really cool indie games up there. And so M's been sort of all of the sound design, mixing stuff. And because I mean, we're working very closely together. It's a very small team. There's like maybe 5 or 6 of us, like in the core development team, essentially, which I'm kind of in close with. And so we're in a Slack chat and just talking basically every day about the game. Um, and along with, we brought in localizers and stuff into that sort of core group to kind of keep chatting about things. So yeah, like I've been close in with the team, the whole 3 years of development or so. And we're working in Game Maker, which
mm.
is kind of I worked on it by myself when I did my own solo development project. And so I'm familiar with like how Game Maker deals with audio, which is not great.
Yeah, well,
um,
that's the thing. A lot of tools without the invocation of middleware.
yeah,
It's often, Epic is making a hard push to try to make Unreal kind of robust and able to do legit stuff that eliminates the need theoretically for Wise or Fmod. But they're the
yeah,
only ones even close. I haven't.
yeah,
I
totally.
imagine this thing is. I've never dabbled with Game Maker, so I don't know the limits, but I've always understood it to be pretty damn
It's yeah, it's
basic.
it's it's pretty basic. Like there's essentially like within the actual like in-engine tools that you can use, you can play loops and you can play one-shots. That's about all you can do as far as what you're telling the engine to do. But you can write your own sort of middleware to get in between what you
Mm.
are scripting and what's actually going to be the engine is being told to do. So essentially, like, because Greg's previous game was a game called Wandersong, it was an entire game based around singing. Like, that was the mechanic. So you had like a instrument wheel that you would pop up and just, pick notes within the scale of every level. Everything was multi-layered and dynamic and all this stuff. So he had all these tools they had built for this dynamic music game. And so we were like, well, this is essentially the same engine, so let's just use those tools. The game isn't about singing, but we can still use those dynamic music implementations to actually like do some cool stuff with the music in the game.
Wow. So walk me through some of the things that you did, because obviously having not played it other than looking over the shoulder briefly at PAX 2 years ago, listening to the album, it does a very good job at feeling like each track feels very much like a piece. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how much of that is a post-editorial process to make a bunch of dynamic music sound like it was made for an album, versus the other way around, where you're creating sort of a linear piece and then saying, okay, how do I sort of break this apart? How do I pass one of those circular pizza slicer things over this to make it kind of behave? What's your normal process for that kind of thing, and what'd you do here?
Well, to kind of like circle back to the second part of the question that I didn't answer yet, I'm
well done.
Hey,
I'm all over the place, so I appreciate being shepherded a little bit.
I try to be elegant in my segues. I don't know.
I like it.
In any case, I've been doing a lot of like my own Fmod implementation, just getting into the thick of it when I've been working in Fmod. So for other projects that I've got going on, doing a lot of just really fun scripting with Fmod, because that's like, I come from a game design background, so like being able to incorporate all those things into my tool set is kind of like one thing that I feel really comfortable and like really excited to like go into. So I'm used to getting in there and doing sort of my own dynamic setup for music tracks. But in this case, since it was sort of a custom middleware thing that was kind of, it's basically like scripted also with Game Maker, so it kind of is its own like executable sort of thing, and it was a little hard for me to wrap my brain around, coming from purely Fmod and that kind of stuff. So Greg handled most of the actual implementation, but I left very detailed notes of how I wanted it to be hooked up. And because we were working one-on-one for most of the project, like there was a lot of like sort of one-off things that we ended up doing, where if it wasn't like possible in the middleware that he had set up, we kind of were like, well, let's just script it. So let's just, let's just make it happen. So there's kind of like two answers to like how I went about doing dynamic stuff for Chicory. The first one is for like basic like background music stuff, because there's kind of two modes in the game. There's sort of the exploring, very like Zelda-like exploration, like sort of screen to screen exploration and painting and puzzle solving and those sorts of things. I wanted to write background music that still kind of felt like a classic Zelda style game, where it was very clearly like, here's background music loops. It's not like dynamic things that are kind of like coming and going. It's very clearly like this is a piece of looping background music, but I wanted to do it in a slightly more elegant way than just that. So what we ended up doing is, on the entire like map of the world, there are very specific screens that are like core to a certain area, and then there's spots between those core areas that are sort of in between zones or the outskirts. And so what ends up happening is, as you leave from one major area, it'll start transitioning into like a low-key version of that background music. So it'll strip away elements, it'll change things a bit to kind of crossfade over into a more low-key version that can then kind of drift away and then come up into the next background music once you've sort of entered the next key area. But the thing that's interesting about those screens is that they're area agnostic. So depending on where you've come from, it's a different piece of music that's leaving. So you could have, if you're coming from the woods, for example, if you go into the transition area between the woods and the village, you have the woods music kind of drifting away. But then if you come from the village, then you have the village music kind of drifting away. So it creates these sort of agnostic zones where the music
Does that mean you're hearing... Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no.
What were you saying?
Oh, no, I was just finishing my sentence. Go ahead.
Fair enough. Does that mean then that there's direct dovetailing and sort of literal overlaps, or is it more like the Olympic torch ceremony where it's sort of like this relay race of things handing off to... Because that sounds really right up my alley. What you're describing, the way things... can be done. Elegance is just always the thing that I kind of obsess over in my own work for this exact reason, because crude, everybody has their nostalgia to the old RPGs of the 90s and 80s, but we can't call those music systems elegant. It was a lot of hard edges,
Right. It's just like,
and it just...
This screen has this music. You go to the screen, next music.
Yeah, it's brutal. And it's funny because as someone who grew up really equally a gamer and a film buff, it was not lost on me that the movies just never did things like that. So I would love the music in a game, but find myself annoyed with it for those reasons. And I didn't really know how to articulate any of that or know what was going on. But that was kind of my struggle. So I love hearing this because I had no idea there was this aspect to the game. It's answering a lot of questions that were implicit just in listening to it, because when you say it feels like a looping piece, that kind of answers, I think, my question that these were essentially conceived of as linear statements, but they're part of like a spider web of possibilities in all directions. Is that fair?
In a way, it's like it doesn't get as complicated as possibly like the coolest version of that system. Like you could do with the right tools, you could make it even more smooth and elegant and all that stuff. But like essentially what happens is, it's transitioning to, a different version of the track as it sort of either linger in those screens and it'll kind of gradually kind of fade away, or you'll go into the next area and it'll kind of, do a bit more of an elegant fade out while the next piece comes in.
Yeah. Where does you said you had a background in game design, and obviously I want to talk about your time at ArenaNet, and we'll pass through all those stations, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I think you are definitely unique amongst composers in that way, especially having made your own game. It's sort of a text adventure, but it's a game as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
totally.
You'd call it a game, I assume.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So having actually really cut your teeth properly and not just been a dreamer in that regard, does that inform your specific outlook on the possibilities of dynamic music? I ask because the subtext of my question is that there's a lot of composers. Actually, a better way to phrase that is composers run the full gamut of opinions on dynamic music, where some are ravenously obsessed with it, which is certainly where I would put myself, where it's like the one thing that I think really makes games in terms of game audio or game music.
Yeah.
And then there's others who just love the creative exercise of games and really couldn't care less about how it interacts with the game, or they delegate that because they feel like I'll just never really understand that. Obviously, you understand it and you have a profound working knowledge of it. But the question is, how much does that enter into your head? How much does it motivate you? What is your relationship, I guess, in general with just the very idea of dynamic or interactive music?
I think it's something that has kind of driven a lot of my curiosity, both in terms of music for games as well as game design over the years. Like I started, tinkering in game design way back when like RPG Maker was sort of like RPG Maker 2000, I think, was the first release that I played around with. So around the year 2000. And
although in fairness, there was like a 5-year window on either side of the year 2000 where everything was called 2000. So
absolutely, yeah.
We haven't narrowed down the date too much, but
you never know.
Exactly.
But in any case, like I picked up that engine basically to just kind of tinker around with, mostly because I was really curious of how game music implementation could work, essentially. Because back in that release, it was pretty tied to like just straight up MIDI files for all of the background music in that engine. And so it had a whole lot of like scripting tools in there to like how to affect the background music, to change the BPM, to change, you know, whatever you're doing with the music, and to play different pieces of music, to play them simultaneously. Like, you know, was doing all of those things, or had the capacity to do it, because you were just playing MIDI files. And so I basically like made an entire like village with a dynamic day-night cycle, and then wrote music for it. And so I was like, you know, how do I reinterpret this piece of music for nighttime, or for afternoon, you know, whatever it is. And so I was like, I was just really curious. Like, I wanted to like figure out how to compose things with different variants to them that made sense for like affecting them over time. Because this was also at a time when, like, I guess like Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time had just come out, and it had sort of the overworld music that changed with the time of day. And so I was like really into figuring out like, how did that actually work? How was that possible? And so a lot of my initial like excursions into game design were fueled by like making interactive systems that the music could tie into.
Is this like high school for you or something? I mean, I'm trying to do the math here, because this feels like this is, you know, 20 years or more ago, which would have made you quite young.
Yeah, it definitely dates me a bit.
Well, no, I mean, I think we're almost exactly the same age, and that's why when I hear you, you know, as I kind of do the math and like put the pins on the map, I'm going, oh wow, this is a very precocious teenager by the sound of it.
So I was in like the middle of high school or whatever, you know, 10th grade, 11th grade, working on this stuff.
Was it a hobby, or was it like, was this one of these things where you thought, this is absolutely what I want to do with my life? Something in this playground, whether it was music or game design, like, was that fueling it, or was it, or is it the other way around, that later you said, this is what I want to do because I got such joy out of this hobby?
I think at the time I wasn't really considering what jobs were as just like a general thing. Like, I was, you know,
how innocent, blissful, and
I definitely like idolized a lot of the game composers that I grew up listening to. Like, I, you know, was very much kind of putting myself mentally in that space of like, I would love to do this. But at the time, like, I didn't know what the possibilities were. I didn't know it would even be possible for me to do something like that, because growing up with the games that I grew up with, like, my perception of video games was very focused towards Japan, where video games that I knew were made in Japan. And so I had to be Japanese to do that. And I was like, well, I can't do that, you know? And so like, it was kind of a weird thing where like I was growing up kind of in this weird, like, separate space where I felt like, you know, I'm going to do my best, you know, to just kind of like write music that I'm inspired by these games. And then, you know, as I was getting older, I was realizing, oh, right, games are made everywhere. You know, it doesn't really matter. I can still be a part of this in some way. So the real like decision point was, you know, when I went to college, you know, kind of deciding where I wanted to go with that. And I kind of had two major choices. You know, one was going to school for music, and the other one was going into school for animation, because I did not great art, but like I was still very passionate about like, you know, drawing and coming up with character designs and that kind of stuff. And so I was like, that was maybe something that I would go into. And, you know, obviously that, you know, I prioritized one over the other and focused on music, and, you know, very glad for that.
Is art, I never knew that about you. Is art or character design or anything like that a part of anything that you do now? Is that something that you kind of find ways to slip into projects that you're working on, even if kind of peripherally?
Not really anymore. Like it kind of like my tendency towards character stuff kind of drifted more in the way of like writing. Because I definitely am more of a writer than an artist these days.
As in
So
narrative,
yeah, like not writing music, but then also writing words. So I'll still write a lot and come up with characters and all of that. But I've kind of
meaning you're doing that for yourself, or you're doing that on
for myself.
like so. For example,
Yeah.
on Chicory or on Celeste, you're not contributing narratively necessarily.
No, I mean like on Celeste, like I did do some like editing, on the writing. So like I, kind of did a couple editing passes here and there to kind of get uh just do some voice work for the characters here and there.
Oh,
But
that's
like
amazing.
um it's sort of it's that kind of stuff is like my favorite part of being a part of small teams, small indie teams that really kind of just embrace everyone, bring everyone into the fold, let everyone kind of have a voice and be part of that collaborative process. And those are definitely the teams that I've fallen, the closest with.
Yeah, and it feels very much like a band playing in someone's garage, which is a
Yeah,
very different vibe than you know having a meeting at the big office where the receptionist, you have to write your name on the sign-in list and show your
right.
ID, and then they swipe the card and it opens the magnetic locks. And I enjoy both, but I definitely resonate deeply with what you're
Yeah.
saying. Of there's something about. I remember on the Banner Saga, which was similarly very small team. There was a thing where we had this idea of having in-world songs where
Mm,
it passed the caravan. The game had this kind of Oregon Trail side-scrolling thing where you would pass by these landmarks. And I
yeah.
said, I think it would be cool if the caravan sings every time you approach one of these. And then when we went to go make the sequel, we was trying to figure out ways to do things differently, similarly, and because there's the second game has a second caravan, and you're kind of narratively ping-ponging back and forth between these two very different groups.
Yeah.
And I said it would be interesting if the second group thinks that singing, because these huge landmarks they call them godstones, and they were like these huge statues.
Yeah.
And I said, what if the second group, the group called the Ravens, what if they're offended at the fact that the other group sings? So I remember I called the writer and I said, can we put in some dialogue that basically has them scoffing when at the beginning of the game when the two caravans are joined? Can we narratively construct into this that the second group never sings and in fact is offended when they do, and that for them singing has a very different kind of ritualistic thing. And we were able to build all this kind of narrative and lore, and I just love that. And it
So
is
cool.
real hard to do that if that person is like 30 different handoffs of emails away and stuff. It can be
Yeah.
tricky.
Yeah, like I've definitely done both also, and really have just in vetting the projects that I decide to put my time towards, like I have pretty much always just prioritized the smaller teams, the more personalized
Mm-hmm.
projects. And those are the ones that I click with. So yeah, it's one and in Chicory specifically, like we had just such a fun such a fun time just like coming up with characters and doing all this stuff, because there's so many characters in the game of just like these really like lovely like illustrated animal characters that our character artist Alexis did. And each of the development team has their own character in the game, so we all kind of designed our own character and put them in there. And there's
Well, so
some
then,
fun.
yes, your art sensibility is making its way into games. Then
There is one character that I've designed in game.
you are a liar. You lied right to my face. Um, I love that. That's very endearing. I'm very curious. Also, again, forgive my ignorance on the game,
Yeah.
because listening to the music, the imagination
Mm-hmm.
wanders. One of the things that I found interesting is that when you listen to the first, I'm assuming that the album is arranged somewhat chronologically to the
Yeah.
extent that the game is chronological.
Yeah.
Yeah. So bearing that in mind, the first half dozen or so tracks are, in a way, and I mean this in the best sense, they are exactly what you would expect when you look at the art and you look at when knowing your sensibility as an artist and as a composer. It's not to say that they are, mundane or that it's predictable, but it's like when you look at the kind of adorable energy of the game art, there's a similar kind of innocence and almost childlike awe and wonder, sort of happiness to the music. And what I found interesting is that when I kind of randomly jump later, that shifts gears a lot. And I was like, holy shit, there's some stuff in here that's pretty damn intense by comparison to that. What am I tapping into here? What don't I know? Because it really feels like it conscientiously lured me in,
yeah,
and then reveals something else. Is that a fair sort of take, or am I just totally drawing connections that don't exist?
No, you're right on the mark, in that it is a very multi-layered game. It's a very multi-layered story. There's a lot of things happening. A lot of the sort of the world design, you might say, of like the areas and all that stuff, like it's very of that nature. That sort of initial, like, here's this really beautiful world that you can color in and do all this stuff, but then the story, the character moments, the boss fights, there are boss fights, and probably what you've been hearing are some of those more emotional, character driven, and also like action driven sections, which very much tap into the core narrative arc of the game, which is not, it is not happy butterflies all the time.
Yeah, it didn't feel like it. It felt it's great because it didn't feel like I had jumped ahead into a different game. It
Right.
felt like this game has evolved into something beyond what the box art, as it were, would kind of. There's a deception in just assuming that you see what you get,
Yeah.
and that's, a lot of games aspire to that. Also, I think a lot of composers don't quite know how to pull off what I felt you pulling off, because that cohesion, the fact that it felt like, okay, yeah, this is a sure absolute continuation. Of course, it helped that there's a very catchy little melody that I kept tracking repeatedly, so that's always one good trick. But you seemed to really kind of hold true to whatever that identity is. Is this a process for you that comes naturally? Is this something that you're doing on purpose? Is it an intellectual? For me, it can be a tad intellectual, where I'll say, okay, this score, I'm just never going to use this instrument ever. Like I make rules, and then I have to find ways to solve my problems with, hopefully, kind of like a really restrictive rule set. I like doing that as a kind of exercise for myself. Is there anything about that with you, or as a feel by feel and touch, or walk me through your process?
So yeah, it definitely depends on the project. But for Chicory, it definitely felt like I was setting restrictions for myself, but as I wanted it to feel like it's kind of parallels the story in a way of like there's a huge amount of restriction, there's a huge amount of tradition and feeling the tradition there, and then as you progress you feel that you are breaking free of that in some way, but still coming from a certain space, right? And the sort of the intentional thing that I brought there, with my writing at least, was to write a series of themes based on characters, and then also associating those themes with instruments, and letting those instruments and the themes carry the through line across the soundtrack, but then taking the initial restrictions that I'd given myself. In this case, like it was, I really wanted to come from a basis of like old instruments, like Renaissance era instruments, some harpsichords, some recorders, lutes, that sort of variety of instruments, and then start branching out from there, so that I could make instrumentations that were kind of still rooted in those same collection of instruments, but then felt like they were kind of being pushed out in various directions. So like one of the very first sort of boss encounters, throughout the entire like first part of like act of the game, like you have this sort of very specific like harpsichord sound. That's kind of the backbone of the initial part of the game. And in the very first boss encounter, I essentially took that harpsichord sound and ran it through a bunch of effects and guitar amps and stuff to make it this big, just kind of like
gnarly,
super distorted, harpsichord, and kind of made that the basis of this, track, and brought in, all the various like synths and drums and stuff, and then kind of pulled back again after that. But like getting those sort of moments, those big climactic moments of like pushing out and then kind of seeing where the score goes from there.
Yeah, it makes me realize something I was also curious about that you've teed up nicely for me here is about your process from a production standpoint, because like when you mentioned recorder, I there's all manner of Kristen I can hear.
Yes.
Kristen Nagus, the world's most superhuman wind player.
Yeah.
And it felt like she was featured a lot. And so I was curious how you work with her and the other musicians. I heard some really lovely performances from some string players and what I heard, and I'm curious how you approach all of that. Again, because I'm aware of a variety of ways, and it's always fascinating when it's wildly different from my own and something I just can't fathom doing. So how do you broach all of that?
In terms of like working with them, or
actually, I'd be curious that too, in terms of like directing them as performers. To what extent you kind of really dig into minutia, and because I've seen some composers that are, they'll spend an hour trying to make sure that the attack on bar 3 is just right, and like really obsessive, minor nitpicky stuff, all the way to just play it and anything is fine. But what I was actually asking, I'm curious to know about that with you in terms of how much you're kind of really involved in the way that the performance actually, how the life in it is brought forth. But what I meant was, for example, some composers will approach a given piece of music in a game, and they'll kind of, like Darren tends to work this way. He sees it as like, I'm going to sit down and create this piece of music, basically start to finish. So, it helps that he tracks all these instruments himself for the most part. Yeah. And so he'll lay down the bass, he'll lay down the guitars, he'll do vocals or a drum pass, all the synth programming and mixing. And it's like, he'll go from 0 to 100. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm sure there's plenty of exceptions, so I don't speak for him, obviously, but he'll go into quite a lot of detail, get it basically finished, make sure that the Supergiant folks are happy with it, and then Darren seems to do a piece truly from start to finish, and by the time he's ready to move on to the next piece, the previous one is effectively finished, mixed in the game. I'm sure that there's nuance to that I'm blasting over, but he really made it sound like it's a finished composition, and it's now in the rearview mirror. It's very much not at all how I work. I don't do that even. I'm almost the diametric opposite of that. And especially in this case, since you're working with musicians that are not you, like Kristen and whomever else, how does that all play out for you?
I'd say I'm definitely closer to Darren in that way, where when I start writing a piece of music, I will have it essentially entirely in my head. I will, compose it, conceptualize it up in here, and record basically like me singing to myself to kind of remind myself of how it goes. And so then when I go to compose, to write it, down, I will just, I get the melody down, I'll get the chords or the bass line or whatever it is, and then start building it out based on how I'm hearing it, essentially. And so yeah, I'll track all of the parts and VSTs and everything, played in all by hand, even like the digital stuff, to layer everything in and kind of call it a finished composition. And then based on the resources that I have, I'll look at like, okay, which of these parts can I financially afford to record live, essentially.
Interesting.
And
so does that mean you had like a mock-up recorder, for example, that was just sitting there waiting to be swapped out?
Yeah, exactly. So like for all of Kristen's parts, all of the string parts, those are all kind of, me mocking those things up, and essentially sort of performing them as I felt, made sense within the context of the song. And then when it came to time to work with the performance or the performers, I render out my mock-up stems. I render out, the other, backup parts essentially, and the MIDI for that part, and pass it off. And they'll take the MIDI and sort of make a rudimentary sheet music for themselves and just perform it. And I'm not very. I don't go into this being like, you have to replicate everything that I've done. It's like, here's my take, right? Here's the notes that I've written. And if you feel emotionally compelled to perform it in a different way, to put more emphasis on something else, I want to leave that to the performer, and for them to feel inclined to bring something to it in their performance. And so then I'll get it back and I'll integrate it into the mix and sort of make sure everything is sounding fine. And if there's anything like super major, like I'll go back and be like, hey, maybe the intonation isn't right here, or whatever it is. But like, anything else, like if there's just like a little change I need to do, I'll just edit it myself, and all that stuff. So yeah, it's a pretty open process. Like I don't feel like I need to be right there and dragging all of the performance sliders for my performers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, especially it kind of sounds like casting an actor in a way where the goal is choosing the right person, knowing that their instincts are 99 out of 100 times going to be everything that you imagined or better.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is like when I'm reaching out to instrumentalists to play something for me, like I do some pretty extensive research of just listening to other stuff that they have done, which is why I tend to work with a lot of like home studio musicians, people that do covers on YouTube, like things, like Carlos Sain and Saint of the Rain Music. Like he's a soloist that I reached out to because of his amazing arrangements that he's done on his channel, and he had that exact like saxophone tone that I was going for, and I was just like, you would be perfect on this, and he was. So
Yeah, you do you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's very much how Kristen and I met as well. She did a cover of Journey on English horn right after it came out, and I was like, I thought, damn, I've worked with some really amazing oboe and English horn players in LA as part of the session musician community, but there was just something really special about the way she played, and I just loved the kind of entrepreneurial spirit where not only did she take it upon herself to do this arrangement, and she made like custom. I mean, I'm probably easily entertained, but I even just the fact that she had made like custom art to have as the placeholder image on YouTube. Turns out she's this talented visual artist, which I had no idea at the time. And but she also did a backing track, with a bunch of mock-up instruments. That was legit. I heard it, and she was so kind of ashamed of her VST prowess, but she did it so smartly because they were 5% of the experience. She leaned very heavily on her own performance and just had those as kind of sparkle in the background. And I thought, oh well, you're someone I need to be in the Kristen business right away. And I don't think I go more than a few days without sending her something now. I mean, she's on every single thing that I do.
Yeah.
There's only one other musician really that's true for me, that it's just I can't fathom making music without them. Two others I can think of really. And so it's made me happy that I'm loving that the world has sort of discovered her, and you really can write. There's real proper writing for her. I mean, I hear really expressive music and stuff that's very beautiful for her in Chicory, and yet also there were things that I thought, oh, she probably had fun tracking that, because that's not the easiest part ever, and that's always nice too.
She's always like super enthusiastic to just try anything, just really just lean into it. And she's, just like what you said, like she's so expressive. And the thing that I really felt really strongly with, she resonated well with Chicory, is that like everything, a lot of the a lot of the woodwind performances are very character driven. There's a little bit of a Peter and the Wolf kind of situation where there's character instruments for a lot of things, and so she was really able to emote these characters through their parts. I felt really, really well. And even though she's playing two characters that are interacting in a duet or something, like she's still able to kind of bring those different characters into how she performed with herself, essentially.
Yeah, it's like Seth MacFarlane doing Brian and Stewie singing in the scene together and literally voicing it all himself. I always thought that was a surreal and kind of unique talent. Let's back up and go back to some basics.
Sure.
Since hearing about your early curiosity about this stuff, it's fascinating to me. Like in high school, I mean, when hearing about your RPG Maker 2000 dabblings, what stands out to me about that was that you were doing it in this very open-minded, curious, and passion-driven sort of way. And it didn't sound, based on the way you said it, that it was driven by this ambition toward pursuing this as a career. So what that makes me wonder is, it's sort of two-pronged question of when did games become a big part of your life, and when did music become a big part of your life, and how did each of those happen?
So it actually kind of happened around the same time, like when I was very, very young. And I
Meaning, like what is very, very young for you?
Like 6.
Okay.
That's kind of like when I became conscious of myself, I feel.
Well, it's so funny how, it's like when I talk, like a dear friend of mine is in his mid-40s, and if he says when I was young, it can mean anything below 29. You know what I mean? So It's like, I'm always trying to calibrate.
Yeah, no, I consider very, very young to be like the very earliest like conscious perception.
Right.
But because both games and music have been a part of my life since then, it just kind of feels like this constant, it's that never ending like bio that you see of like, I've been playing games my whole life, that sort of thing. It's, it feels like that's the case. But it's also weird that there's like 6 years of my life when I wasn't.
Unaccounted for.
Yeah, it's just kind of like the mystery days.
It's a error 404 kind of situation. At least that's how it feels like for me.
Yeah.
It's like one day the computer came online and there's just mysterious absence of data prior to that.
Yeah. But around that, the same time I started playing games, because I got an NES and a Game Boy eventually. I think it was a little later that I got the Game Boy. But I was playing games, and then also I was in a choir as a child. So I was in a children's choir. And learning music theory, learning solfege, learning all of these things, advancing through these different choirs, towards the sort of performing touring choir when I was like 9, 10, 11. So, that period of my life, like I was very seriously, thinking about music. And
what drove that? I mean, your parents had to have something to do with that, I would think.
Yeah, I think they encouraged me, but I pretty distinctly remember, like, at least my mom, like, remembering something of like me just kind of pointing out a choir in like a pamphlet at school or something, and being interested in it. And so my parents, were like, okay, sure.
So there are
put her in choir.
Are your parents or anyone else in your family in general particularly musical?
Yeah, my dad is a fiddle player, violinist. He's a composer as well.
Okay, that starts to explain things a little bit.
Yeah, so music was definitely like a constant thing when I was growing up, even beyond all of that.
What about your parents in terms of gaming? Like, who put the Game Boy and the NES in your hands, or what? I should say, what prompted that? Was it just, again, you looking at a pamphlet of like Nintendo Power magazine and going, I want?
Yeah, I don't remember specifically. Like, there might have been some like peer pressure involved, or not, but like peer influence, not
right,
pressure.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, I just remember at one point it was a present, and I started playing games, and that was, I'd have to ask my parents for like further clarification of
I mean,
how that happened. But like, I just remember like there was video games suddenly, and I was playing them and having fun. So
I asked because we're kind of right at the cutoff of the age demographic where it's not unreasonable that our parents basically got themselves an NES and then chose to share it with their kids.
Yeah,
which is a little bit the situation when I was growing up, because I have a lot of memories of watching my dad and my sister play, Mario and Tetris and whatever else on NES together, and then I being kind of brought into the fold. Not that either of them are gamers, especially, but that's why I was curious if it was like music, kind of ambiently, like they're into it, or this was you kind of finding your own thing.
Well, it was definitely because I'm the elder sibling. My sister is 6 years younger than me, so she would have just been born when the game systems entered the household. So maybe that was also part of it, of like we'll keep her entertained with video games while we're raising a second child.
Yeah, right. Distract her while we go off the grid for about the next year and a half.
Something like that. But yeah, like it's and
hey.
So. But
on a whole career, I guess, by doing that.
It worked out.
For real.
But yeah, that's and so those two were very closely associated in the general timeline of me growing up. So whether it was coincidental, whether it kind of happened by choice, like it just kind of ended up being that way, I guess.
And at what point did music shift from I'm singing in a choir and I'm passionate about it to I actually want to make it? I want to take these notes and put them together in a way that I've never tried before and see what happens.
Yeah, I definitely got started in that like late middle school, early high school, where at the time I was really into online role-playing communities, like text-based role-playing. And so one of the communities that I was a part of, one of my friends did arrangements of like MIDI arrangements of Sonic the Hedgehog music. And so I was just like talking with him one day and just like asking him like how do you do what you do? Like how do you make these MIDIs? So he introduced me to a program called Noteworthy Composer, which was like my first DAW essentially.
Right.
And so that was, a sheet music interface that that outputted general MIDI essentially. And so my dad hooked me up with a keyboard that had, it was a Yamaha PSR 530, I think. It was a pretty good general MIDI synthesizer. And so hooked that up into my computer and did MIDI out, MIDI in with that. And so I just started arranging songs from games and just kind of, or not even arranging them, just transposing them. Transcribing, sorry.
I was going to say, are you unsatisfied with the key that like Koji Kondo chose? Or
no, it was terrible. This should never have been in G.
Yeah, exactly. Show you.
Yeah, no, transcribing them because I just wanted to, transcribe them because MP3s were still pretty high file sizes, so I didn't really have a whole lot of.
I remember the heyday of sharing MIDI files.
Yeah.
That was the thing. That was the burgeoning internet.
Yeah, I mean, I was a part of the vgmusic.com community, which was
nice.
that big and still up, like the still archives of all these MIDI files that people were making of video game music, both transcriptions and then also arrangements. And so I was on there all the time downloading MIDI files, like opening them up in Noteworthy Composer, seeing how they were all put together, and then doing my own. Like I have one that's up on there, I think, something from Ocarina of Time. So yeah, wow. Like I kind of just got in at the ground floor just by transcribing and seeing. So it's generally how I learn, is I like picking things apart and seeing how they tick. So
it's still a non-trivial step to take to listen to something and transcribe it or transpose it if you're feeling extra bold. And actually creating your own thing. I mean, what made you make that move? It takes a certain amount of courage. A lot of people, especially the deeper down you go, the sort of the rabbit hole of learning the repertoire, and the more you start to realize, like, wow, these towering figures that are creating this music, how can I possibly, have the hubris to try to stand amongst them? It's a very common thing that young, early young creative types have to contend with. How did you bridge this gap of now I want to make my own stuff?
I mean, I think it was pretty simple for me. It's just like I didn't listen to a lot of pop music. I didn't listen to a lot of, music that was being targeted towards me. I just wanted to I liked video game music, and I wanted to write more music for me to listen to, basically. So, I wrote the music I wanted to hear, essentially. And
does that mean that you were kind of fictionalizing games that music
absolutely.
was for?
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, and I, from almost every piece that I was writing had some sort of like, this is the town square, or like this is a battle theme, or whatever it is. Like, it was all kind of framed around the context of games at the time. And in some cases, like, experimenting with RPG Maker, like, to actually put them in a game, even though it was like all the assets were already there, but it was still, my music was in there and my writing was in there. So it still felt like something that I was creating. But yeah, I just really wanted to express myself, I guess, and just, write stuff that was mine.
So what's fascinating about that, obviously it's kind of the cliche. A lot of composers start with very absolutist musical training and experience, where music is a self-justified art. You write string quartets and piano etudes and orchestral works or choral music. And obviously there's one school of very academic thought that is happily on its dying breath, that anything other than the deeply, deeply personal self-expression from the composer, free of all external constraints, represents some kind of sacrifice, or, well, you got to pay the bills somehow kind of thing. Obviously, you and I can just tell we feel similarly about that attitude. And it was something I definitely had to deal with as part of my education, because I wanted that. I wanted to know what those people could teach me, but I hated their attitude. And it took me a long time to kind of fully shake free of it. But that said, you, not that long ago, released a solo album not attached to any game. So in a way, you've circled back from this, like, I'm very much thinking in this headspace of writing music for games, to now I'm just going to express myself purely on my own terms. Walk me through how we got there, and tell me what I don't know about that album, which I admire quite a lot. I was happy to download it the instant it became available, and it was very you, but it was also very, what I really only knew of you at that point was Celeste, and it was not that. But it still felt intuitively like I could feel the connective tissue. So I'd love to just hear. I'm throwing a lot of different things in your direction right now, so I'm not really asking something specific. I just kind of want to hear where your mind has wandered in response to what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's definitely like the journey from getting education in music towards where I am in my career right now has been kind of this weird meandering path, I feel, in a lot of ways, where I started after college trying to very specifically get a job in games, and it didn't really work out. Like, it was not the right time, or whatever it was. Like, I didn't have enough experience. All these things kind of played into just me throwing what I was writing at the giant wall of like AAA hiring sort of thing, and like, going to demo derbies and those sorts of things, and like all of these traditional things that I was told were like how you got into games.
Does that mean you were looking for freelance, like, I want to land a gig scoring a game, as opposed to staff positions?
Yeah.
I had no idea that you ever had a chapter. Well, I'd unpack, just briefly, remember your train of thought, but I want to pause on that for just a second and hear more about what made you feel like that wasn't the right time. I mean, obviously, if it didn't yield any work, that's one obvious analysis, but I'm just curious to learn more kind of about that chapter. I don't know anything about that period of your life.
Yeah, it was because I left college, I graduated and got my degree and everything, and at the very end there, like the last year and a half, I'd say, of college, like I got really into, like I joined the Game Audio Network Guild. I went to a couple of GDCs. I was networking with people on like the forums for the sample libraries that I was trying to write music in, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of being presented a game industry that was looking for a kind of music that I wasn't writing, essentially. Like it was,
Huh.
2006 or so. And so like everything was like big Call of Duty, Hollywood, AAA action stuff. Like that was the only thing that I was hearing from other composers, like trying to get jobs and everything. And so, that was me. Like I went to,
How would you describe the music that you were writing?
um, like trying to go in that direction, but not going far enough to feel like I was a part of that. But then also just trying to be me and like that kind of being in conflict. I definitely wrote a lot of, music that was kind of trying to be fully orchestral, with sample libraries and stuff, but then also like including a lot of synths and a lot of like weird like effects and like stuff. And it just kind of like it ended up, I don't know, sounding kind of like I was trying too hard in a lot of
Huh.
ways. At least that's my perception. Like I'm my own worst critic, but
Yeah. What would happen when you would submit for jobs and stuff, or found yourself with a chance to demo, or what was kind of the experience like?
Um, kind of two things. Either I didn't hear anything, or I got the opportunity to demo, and like I got to sort of like the final round, and then someone else was hired.
Right.
So I was kind of like always like the second pick, for a couple of projects that I was, getting at least the opportunity to demo for. It was a lot of weird stuff. Like uh, one of one of the games that I ended up demoing for was Clive Barker's Jericho. If you remember that game at all.
Yeah, Chris Velasco ended up doing that game.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, I distinctly remember that being a fascinating thing to see Clive Barker. I had no idea he was interested in games. It turns out he's worked on multiple games now.
yeah, yeah,
But I only knew him because I had studied under Chris Young, who had
yeah,
worked with him on film,
yeah.
and so I was very familiar with who he was. But that how did you cross paths with those folks? What that's a
There was, so my very first gig was actually writing like one additional track for this like war game, basically like this PC budget board game that really like it was a bunch of us like entering the industry, like a number of people that were like connected through gang essentially were writing like additional tracks, and it was just like
hmm,
World War I, here's war music, and it was just kind of like not, it wasn't what I wanted to write. It was just kind of like here's something that would fit the bill. And so through the folks that I was working with there, like we like as a group were essentially like given the opportunity to demo for for Jericho. And so the main composer, like he wrote this beautiful melody, and just kind of like did this weird sort of like treatment for it with electronics and all of that. And I didn't really know where I fit into that, so I was just like, can I just write like my own like arrangement of this melody and see if it has any traction whatsoever? And like, and so I wrote this like, it was a very, it turned out to be like a very like Castlevania it's inspired
huh.
like Symphony of the Night kind of like sweeping orchestral sort of thing, that I thought was kind of cool, but like obviously had no no traction with what the game actually was.
Yeah, as I recall, it ended up being much more straight horror. I
Oh
think
yeah,
like
super horror, very kind of like industrial sort of
right.
electronic gritty sort of sound. Um, but yeah, it was an interesting thing. But then there was also like at at one point a very big I don't even, it's like ancient NDAs, but like at one point a very big name in games was making an MMO, and I demoed for that. And it was sort of like this steampunk MMO. Um, and so I wrote this like interesting like hybrid orchestral synth thing to kind of be this sort of like forest, but there's like steampunk stuff in the forest, and I don't know. It was an interesting demo track. That also, that was the one, like the closest I got to actually getting like my first gig, essentially. But I was essentially like number 2 on that. But then the game never actually happened, so as it does.
All too familiar with that, yeah. Well, so then it sounds like. Well, sorry, what were you about to say?
Oh, I mean, I was basically going to segue out of that by saying, like, there was just a number of those things, over the course of like maybe a year and a half of looking for gigs, and I was still living with my parents. I needed to get a job. I needed to move out, and so I just was like, I need to do something that's not this. And so that's how I got into the greater game industry, by looking for like QA positions and so that was my very first actual like full-time job, was working certification QA at Nintendo of America. So that was like my first 2 years in the industry was just doing that while I was still writing music for myself, like on commutes and stuff.
So would you describe the thing that made you go look for a job like that?
Mm-hmm.
Was it a practical thing in your mind? Were you just trying to be sort of sensible and even keeled about it? Or did you feel discouraged, like, fuck this, this, like, I don't want them, they don't want me. Like, how was it volatile, or did you feel like, oh, maybe I'm just not ready? Or like, just walk me through how you felt about all that.
I mean, it was a mixture of things for sure. Like I definitely felt discouraged. I felt that like I had no real connection to the rest of the industry, and I needed to like find a way to connect with that. And I had made some casual friends, just going to GDC and kind of finding other composers that I vibed with, but like there wasn't really anything for me to go off of, and so I felt like maybe I wasn't experienced enough to land anything yet, and then also that every opportunity that was being presented was something that was very much not something that I really gelled with. So yeah, it was a big combination of things, of like not really sure how my music fit into the industry at that point.
So did you go? So that, I think, road eventually does lead you to ArenaNet. I would think.
Yeah.
Was there any stop between Nintendo and there, or was it one to the next?
There's a brief stop at Warner Brothers Games, which was also located here, and so that was like going from a platform holder, Nintendo, to Warner Brothers, which was a publisher, to ArenaNet, which was developer. So it was kind of like getting closer and closer to development.
Right. Into the inner solar system, one planet at a time.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I was there, was really kind of where I found my passion for just game development in general. Like, I didn't really know what it was like to make a game until I was at ArenaNet. And
did you join initially? Because you were in the sound department. You were doing like dialogue editing and stuff, if I recall.
No. I was doing QA initially. So before I joined a couple years before the game released, Guild Wars 2 released, and about a year or 6 months or so into working there was a design position that opened up, and so
that's right.
Yeah, so while I was working there, I was kind of fiddling around with the design tools and was like, I could probably do this, and this seems fun. So when the design position opened up, I applied for it, and I didn't actually get hired directly onto the Guild Wars team, but I was hired onto a prototyping team, where I was basically one of 2 designers, and we were essentially creating a prototype for a game that never actually got made, but it was just an internal project, and so I essentially like got to have a mentor that was teaching me how design language worked and how to script things and how to do all these things. And I was coming up with like event systems and quests and stuff using the scripting languages that they had. And then kind of in my head, I was thinking of like, how does music fit into this? How, all this stuff. And so when I eventually did, like the prototype project got canceled, I joined Guild Wars 2 for the last year of development there, and I was on the story team. So when I was on the story team, I kind of headed up music implementation for the story, because we had all of these, all the music had been written like for years. We had a whole bunch of Jeremy Soul's stuff that was all just sitting there waiting to be implemented
from way back. Yeah,
from way back, and so there was all of these like cues that were for various like emotional things in the storyline that were none of the other story designers like were really on top of like putting that music to the story moments. And they just kind of a lot of them really wanted like the background music to just keep playing. We're just in the world, we don't need to like script something specific for this. And I was very adamant of like, no, we need to have moment, we need to have music at key moments to really like sell some of these things that are happening. Like there's some heavy stuff in this story, like we need to like and so
I love it. I mean, you're a storyteller. I mean, that's such a difference. It's not, music isn't wallpaper, or it's not carpeting. It's part of the air we're supposed to be breathing.
Yeah, and so I pretty much spearheaded just, hey, let's actually take into consideration these music cues that we do have. And so I cataloged words.
Categorized. I like that.
Categorized.
I don't know how that's not a word.
It is now.
Yeah, it's official.
I made a list of all of the music cues that we had that felt like were for story moments, and then I took some of the existing ones that could possibly cross over, like background music that could possibly cross over into like things that we could change to sell a story moment, and sort of made this list and gave it to all of the other quest designers and was like, okay, go through your quests and let's see what what we can assign here to like bump it up a little bit emotionally.
Now, at some point in there, our friend McLean was sort of picking up the mantle on new Guild Wars music. Does what
so he was the sound designer. So he was the guy that came from doing. I think he did some dialogue editing.
I think I just made that up because I remember at some point reading whenever Celeste came out, and I was like, I want to know more about this Lena person. I had seen that you had ArenaNet history, and I think I just remembered it wrong, because I knew it wasn't. The thing that was striking was that you weren't like a staff composer or something that had just struck out and gone indie. You had a more novel thing. I just had remembered it wrong. It's actually more interesting that you were sort of a designer and doing this narrative work than someone who's doing essentially like grunt work in the audio department, like dialogue editing, which is very tedious. And like you were, in a way, this is far better composer training, because you're really getting into the meat and the grit of game design and of storytelling in the medium in a way that's just, I mean, my God, in a way I envy that. How amazing to have that kind of experience, especially on a grand canvas, something with the ambition of a game like Guild Wars 2.
Yeah, like it definitely was a huge benefit that like Guild Wars 2 was not only MMO, but just a huge, gigantic world, with so many things to explore. Like there was always a need for more music, as content was being made.
That's sort of where my question was headed, is that I know obviously Jeremy's music was kind of the seed, and that at some point McLean took over. Did at any point the timeline of all this work out that you got to actually make music requests through your position, as in, hey, this doesn't exist, like McLean or whomever, can this exist next week or a month from now or whatever? Like, were you able to kind of direct at that point?
In a way, like my involvement kind of came about from that, because when the game shipped, we change focus. Like the quest team kind of split up a little bit, and there was a couple of us that were primarily focused on making like new holiday content. So like we had Halloween coming up, we had Christmas coming up, and these sorts of things. We didn't really have a lot of new story stuff yet. So we had the story for the game that had come out, and then we were going to supply it with holiday content. And so McLean had already started like writing like a Halloween theme, kind of, very just kind of like jovial, like Halloween Town sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. You're writing new music for the game. And we were designing the events essentially at the same time. So like Halloween and Christmas were both being developed at the same time by different teams. And so I was on the Christmas team. And so one of the, and this is the story that I generally tell a lot, because it's very indicative of just kind of how I got into actually working on the game. There was a whole bunch of events, like sort of like mini games, various sorts of things that we could possibly develop for the holiday, like on a whiteboard brainstorming session sort of thing. And one of them was bell choir. It's just kind of like an abstract concept. And I was like, oh, I love bell choirs. Like, I played bells in a bell choir once, and that's music. That's cool. So I kind of like...
Freaking hard to write for, though.
Yeah.
You have to it's like writing for piano where you have to think about each finger.
Is one person.
As a person. And I tried it one time. In high school, I tried writing one piece for our high school handbell choir, and I found the amount of mental bandwidth relative to writing an orchestral piece, I was like, my God, this is too hard. This is a pain in the ass.
Yeah. And
I've never known anybody, I didn't know that anybody ever brought that to games. You're delighting me right now.
So like, it was a totally abstract idea of just like bell choir. What is this? And so I was like, can I pitch something with this? And so I just like, I took that onto my plate. I was just like, I want to come up with something that's bell choir for Christmas. And
that's awesome.
So what I ended up coming up with is I prototyped the system that was basically like Guitar Hero for bell choir, essentially, where you had like a visual of a bell, like you just were all the bells, but you had a visual of a bell, and you kind of had this like track in front of you. And I took the combat system from the game and I turned it into essentially Guitar Hero UI, where you could have projectiles being fired from a source. And so I made these note projectiles that kind of were the slowest possible velocity. So they like very slowly went down the thing. And then before they hit you, you had to hit them with your bell, and that made the note.
That's amazing. It's so fun. I had I was really, really hooked on EverQuest when it came out.
Yeah.
And to the point that when I quit, it felt like I was in a fucking 12-step program, because it was so difficult to break free of it. So I kind of swore off MMOs in this very kind of conscientious way, and right in time for Warcraft to come out. So by the time of Guild Wars, I was like, I gotta steer
no more. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like it's because I know I would struggle to say no more if I broke the seal. I need a game that can roll in credits.
So, you can move on to a different game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the result is that things like what you're describing, I've largely missed out on, and because what you're saying sounds so awesome. I had no idea this existed. You're exposing a major ignorance on my. I mean, this must have been a hit, because there's nothing. There can't be anything else like this.
No, it was pretty fun to like just come up with something that like. Who would have thought, like, let's put a rhythm game into an MMO, and like a couple of MMOs have done that kind of stuff since then. But
this did ship though, right? It didn't. Mm-hmm. It didn't like. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It must have been received amazingly then.
Yeah. It ended up working out, and the thing though that was the impetus for me to actually like write music was we didn't have any like Guild Wars holiday songs.
Right, sure.
And so like I had to basically like I needed to have songs that you were actually playing for the minigame. And so I essentially took my like 4-part or choral writing, or in this part 3-part writing into account. And because all of the stages were circular. I just came up with this like design basically where it was like you had a circular stage with 3 people in the center, and each person gets a wedge, like a 33% wedge of the stage, and then there's 3 parts. So you actually have 3 different people playing in harmony with each other on these bell parts. So essentially, I wrote a bunch of like 3-part harmony compositions that were vaguely holiday themed.
That's awesome.
And then arranged a couple of like existing Guild Wars songs for 3-part harmony. And so yeah, like McLean and the audio team kind of like got wind because they had to record bell sounds for the bell choir, and they're like, "Wait, you wrote all these songs?" And I was like, "Yeah, no, yeah, and you write music? Oh yeah." And McLean was like, "Oh, that's so cool!" Like, and I just asked him, I was like, what if can I just write like a Guild Wars style orchestral version of one of these songs that I wrote? And he's like, yeah, sure, go for it. And so I just, over a weekend, I just came up with a orchestral version of one of the songs I had written. And so I brought it in the next week and played it for the audio team. And they were like, oh, this is really good. And then they shared it with the trailer team. And they were like, oh, we love this. And so they cut the trailer for the holiday event to my song. And then they just put it in, and then they put it in the game. So it was just like, well, okay, I guess I'm in the game now. And that kind of like broke open the gates of like, we have someone that can write music for the game as well as McLean.
What I love about that is how contrasting that is to just the few years earlier of pitching on projects and demoing and putting yourself out there. And because the way you phrased it was very telling of you were essentially writing music for an industry that didn't really exist at that time. And what I love is that by not just bailing and going and doing something different with your life, you found eventually, obviously, I'm sure it didn't feel very one-to-one, over the span of those years, but you really did organically find a way in that just leveraged exactly what you wanted to do. I mean, it's such a wonderful story that so many, because I get asked, I'm sure you do too, advice by those who are just, who are you in 2006 back and then, who I was in 2006 as well, of like, what do I do? And there's a kind of contradictory answer that I always want to give, because on the one hand, it's like you should hustle like you've never hustled before and really like put yourself out there and know that you're going to get rejected and just learn to stomach it and kind of develop a thick skin. But yet at the same time, you don't have to endure that, and just try to remain open to the idea that the plan you've built for yourself may not be the right execution, but if you remain open to the kind of way the wind moves, you'll kind of land on a lily pad that you might not have. Like you can't cannonball onto it necessarily, and so it's really hard, because sometimes the victor to the spoils go to the victor, of like somebody that just bludgeons their way forward and just has the sheer willpower to do it. And like, I applaud that. It takes a lot of dedication, and obviously, you take a lot of shots and get hit a bunch. God knows I know how that feels. It's still, to this day, I routinely deal with that kind of thing. But at the same time, I also admire that, because there's nothing complacent about what you just told me. There's nothing that feels like, oh, well, I just kind of went into this autopilot and then I got lucky. Like, you very much had to show a sort of aggression's not the right word, but you had to strike when there was an iron there. You had to actually have initiative. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And so it's what a wonderful lesson. I sincerely hope I will make a note. I'll have to flag our dear friends at the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences on the exact time code that this ends up in, because this is the story you just told is a wonderful thing to bear in mind for anybody that's going, I don't know what my path will be. And it just shows a very different path that bore. It's not just, oh, I managed to stay in the industry long enough. Like, you really did something that only you would have done in those circumstances. I find it's a very inspiring story.
Yeah, it's like you were saying, like it's really difficult to to give a very specific, piece of advice of here's exactly how I did it, which is going to be completely different for you. And
this advice you can do what I did if you are me and you lived through my exact events back then.
Yeah, but you realize that everyone has their own story, everyone has their specific series of events that they go through to get to where they are. Even the people that are charging straight ahead, they probably have a past that informs that and allows them to be that powerful force that charges through all these things and perseveres. It's everyone kind of has their path. And I think that the trick is finding it, and realizing that you're on the right path.
Yeah. Did you ever have occasion to work with or hang out with, I guess, Kate Welch?
Oh yeah.
She was the first person I ever met. I actually met McLean through her.
Oh yeah.
Because she became a good friend and was like, "Do you know our music guy?" I said, I don't actually. She introduced me to him.
Oh, cool.
And it gave me a very positive impression of ArenaNet as a work environment. I don't know if that's actually true, because it could be that I just met all the nice people, and then now you're completing the trifecta of that time, because ironically, every one of the three of you is now gone from there. But it seems like it was nonetheless a great incubator for folks, and certainly a springboard for McLean. And so it seems for you as well.
Totally. It's I feel like I wouldn't have stayed there for 7 years in total if it had been like a hostile work environment. Like it very much was like you said, like an incubator for just letting me experiment and see what worked, and having the allowance to do weird things with game design, with storytelling, with music, all these things. Some of the stuff that I was doing when I was working both as a game designer and a composer was essentially like giving myself work in a lot of ways, where I was designing boss encounters and then scoring them with dynamic music. I was doing sort of like a full package of creating this event and just kind of being the director and the composer and all these things. It was
truly excellent. I so love that.
Like experiences that I would never have had the chance to do at that scale, on a AAA MMO. I couldn't have done that on my own anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. Well, what made you? So then, what catalyzed the leap out of there, and does Celeste tie in directly with that? Was that kind of okay? This is now the thing I need to be doing, or how does all that square? Because that was the impression I had, was that when Celeste kind of exploded, you were pretty reasonably recently out of ArenaNet. It was your immediate prior kind of resume item, as it were.
So there was actually one step between, but
bring me up to speed.
Yeah, so I had started working on Celeste, in sort of my last days at ArenaNet, but at the time I was also considering just going to a different job, because I'd been at ArenaNet for 6+ years at that point, and I was like, I feel a bit worn. I've been working on the same game for this amount of time, and so I really wanted to try a different experience in game dev. And at the time, I was working on Celeste, and I was like, well, this is going really well. This is cool, but I still need a full-time job.
Right.
So I actually moved to Montreal to join Ubisoft for a year.
Wow, I did not ever know about that.
Yeah, so I was
as a designer.
As a level designer, actually. So it was kind of taking a slightly different approach to design there. So I worked on Far Cry 5 for a year.
No kidding.
Yeah, and so I was
way pre-ship, I guess, early days.
No, it was around the last year of development.
Really?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm conflating 4 and 5. What year was that? It feels like it's too long ago for that to
2018. So they both came out in the same year.
Wow, fair enough.
Yeah.
In my mind, Celeste was several years before that. I guess I have no my time dilation is all fucked up.
Yeah. No, it's been about 3.5 years since Celeste came out. So yeah.
Crazy.
But yeah, so I was there at Ubisoft from 2017 to basically, for the year of 2017.
Got it.
Um, and so I was doing level design, and quest design was a part of level design. So that's kind of where I ended up in their hierarchy. And that, it was a thing. I did a lot of work, and then most of it was thrown out by the time the game shipped. So
It's funny because as Guild Wars 2 is an earnest AAA title, Ubisoft is a whole other
it's a very different.
beast of just. I mean, I worked on one of the Assassin's Creed games, and I remember one
Yeah.
of the producers telling me that it was, I think he said 1,008 was the total number of people that worked on that game.
Yeah.
Across studios, all the way, all the different, Quebec, Montreal,
Yeah.
Paris, and Singapore. Like, it's just hard to fathom.
It was about as far as I could get from where I feel at home in the
Yeah,
development
right.
environment. And so yeah, it was very much it was definitely sort of a trial by fire, and solidified the fact for myself that I didn't really want to work in AAA.
Right, sure.
So it was a lesson learned, but I'm glad I had the experience to at least kind of like see what that feels like, in that process. And
Well,
then
there's
also,
something to be said. There's the one kind of person that takes a bite of something and says, "Well, I'm content to never taste this again."
yeah,
Versus the other person that looks at it, doesn't like the look of it, and just won't even give it a shot.
right.
Because you never know. You may have felt so at home. I mean, it may have been this revelatory experience to realize, holy shit, I love this team is so huge, and there's all these creative people in all directions, and you may have had a wildly different reaction to it. And it may have totally changed the trajectory of your life as a result. To me, it's a powerful, positive thing to say, I took the bite, and I can say with wisdom, I can say with actual sort of lived experience and accrued knowledge,
yeah,
this is not the environment for me. A lot of folks prejudge things from afar and make the best call that they can, which is sometimes all you have to work with. But I think that, in your case, it's an informed opinion, which is better than most can say.
Yeah, and so by the
But you were
time,
already in bed with the Celeste team by that point. Like you had connected with them, and you were well off and running on the music at that point.
yeah, and it was one of those things where like I wanted to make sure when I got the job, like that I was going to be able to still work on Celeste and have it not be like absorbed by Ubisoft or anything,
Right. Yeah.
all that stuff. And so by the time that full year had passed, like, I was looking at like, okay, do I want to keep doing this? And, the answer was basically no. Like, Celeste was wrapping up. I really wanted to focus on that. And then what happened next, was kind of like what shaped the rest of my career trajectory, of like, yes, this is a success and people do actually want to hear my music, and let's see where that goes. But
obviously, it's not unrealistic that Celeste could have been one of innumerable other indies that just kind of has a little flash and then disappears, and
yeah.
And you would have been sitting there going, okay, well, what now?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was definitely a period of time when I was, moving back to Seattle where I was like, I need contingency plans. If
Sure.
if Celeste doesn't take off, like I got back in touch with the ArenaNet folks. I was like, kind of fully prepared to be like, well, if I can't make a living doing this freelance stuff, like I set up a Patreon, like I did all this stuff to kind of give me at least like a cushion to like, fall back on for freelancing. And, I was talking with ArenaNet folks of like, hey, maybe I could come on as, more of a full-time composer sort of thing if this freelance stuff doesn't work out. Just kind of getting all my options out there. And so I did end up actually doing some more contract work for ArenaNet after Celeste had come out, which was a very interesting thing, kind of like returning to that, in least a freelance capacity.
Sure.
But it was still kind of like, here's a couple of like one-off sorts of things when I had time for it or when they needed me.
Yeah. How did you first, I try to avoid going places that I'm sure you've gone, in especially with all the interest that Celeste generated after it came out.
Yeah.
Anyone curious to learn the nuts and bolts of your involvement, I'm sure there are ample interviews and things that can be found about that. But I am curious because I selfishly don't know the answer, how you first connected with that team. Because it's not connected to ArenaNet or anything as far as I'm aware.
No, it was primarily through social groups at the time, because I was friends with folks in the indie game development community around that time. And I also had actually put out an EP of electronic music around the same time. And I'd done another independent soundtrack called Hack Mud that came around a little before then. So both the EP and Hack Mud actually kind of like ended up in the Celeste team's laps of like listening, considering composers. And I had I was just on Twitter and being social with folks there, and I'd gone to GDC with some friends. I sort of made the return to GDC, and instead of going to all the sessions, like I stayed out on the lawn, the park area, and like chatted with a bunch of the indie developers that were there for for indie track stuff, and then also just socializing and seeing each other's games, hearing about them and stuff. So yeah, through those connections, I basically got a DM on Twitter from Maddie, the lead designer on the game, which is like, "Hey, I'm working on this game called Celeste. Do you want to do music for it?" And I was like, "Sure."
Did you have any sense? Forgive me, I'm sure that you have been asked this before.
Oh, it's all good.
Did you have sense at the specialness of the game? Early. Sometimes games just have that magic quality where you go, "This is something," and then sometimes they surprise us because people really take to them, and you're like, "Wow!" You always hope for that, but this one felt like it could go either way, and happily it is. What was your initial sort of gut about the game?
Well, I did some like initial research of like who's making this game, like what have they done before, and I saw like Celeste was originally like this sort of Pico 8 like even like smaller scale platformer that was made for a game jam, and so the full game of Celeste was being based on that. So I was able to kind of take a look at that and see some videos of that being played, and then also saw obviously that Maddie had previously worked on Towerfall, which was a huge blow up success, and I was like, oh wow, like this, they know what they're doing.
Right.
I definitely got a sense that like they were on a track towards something, and I didn't know like what Celeste eventually would become, like as a sort of narrative object, but at least I knew it was going to be a really good platformer,
right?
And so I was like, yeah, I love platformers, I would totally love to score level music for one of these. And then the sort of emotional character resonance that came out of that was kind of a surprise as we went along, and kind of just leaned into it.
What's been your, skipping to then the ship of it, what has been your relationship to its success? Like, I know that it's kind of vaguely worded, but I'm just curious because it obviously, it sort of, it very immediately sort of catapulted you into a position of being one of the recognized names in the industry, and primarily because of the fact that you were now interwoven with an experience that people held very close to their heart. People had these just intense emotional relationships with the game, and the music is part of the DNA of that in a way that can't be really separated out.
Yeah.
What has been, I guess my question is, what was your relationship to the success initially of it? And what has been the ongoing relationship with it? Because if it's anything, every now and again, this kind of thing would happen. And like, for example, was talking not that long ago with Gareth Coker, and my instinct tells me that no matter what he does for the rest of his life, Ori will be this thing over his shoulder. And that's a very positive thing from my perspective. I saw an interview with Jeff Bridges where somebody said to him, you've been in so many movies, you've won an Oscar, but for most people, you'll forever be the dude from The Big Lebowski.
Right.
And
right.
is that bad that like, that's not what you won the Oscar for? Like most people probably don't even know what character that was. Like, does one thing forever being like, this is me, is that a positive? And his attitude was very much like, there are a lot of actors, including very successful actors, that don't have their version of the dude. I'm very grateful that there could possibly be a character, even just one, that might carry my name past my own lifetime even. Like, he had a really wonderful and beautiful reaction to the idea that 25 years ago or 20-ish years ago, I did a character that's going to probably outlive me. I would not be surprised if Celeste is very much the same with you. It will be a game, I think, that people talk about and continually think about and dissect. And as that team, which of course you've announced your next project with them, which is very exciting and looks very beautiful. And I loved what I heard of yours in the initial announcement. Like, it will be the thing, as their and your collective success creates new projects, it will also make people go, who are new at that point, saying, oh, I wonder what their earlier work is like. And so there'll just be a continuous churn of people discovering Celeste for the first time and go, holy shit, where have I been all this time? I can't believe it's 10 years later and where has this game been all my life? I know I'm throwing this at you a lot of different ways, but what is your kind of relationship to all that? Because it's a thing that very few composers get to experience.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been an arc for me in a lot of ways where like the initial feelings of it were like surprise and just like, wait, what's happening? It's kind of like that. The moment that sort of is crystallized in my brain is I was on the train up to Vancouver for the launch party for the game, and it was literally like the game had, because the train is super early, from Seattle to Vancouver, so I had to get there at like 7:30, and the game was set to launch at 9 a.m. So like the train the train departed at around 8 or so. So right as we're getting close to the border, is when the game is scheduled to launch. And I also had to release the Bandcamp album at the same time. So I was on my phone with very spotty reception, like waiting until I saw that the game was live on Steam, and like we're in our developer chat being like, okay, it's time to go. And then 9:00 happens and I go into my Bandcamp and I'm just like on my phone, like, okay, launch the album. And then almost like several minutes after that point, like I just kind of like put everything down. I was like, okay, it's done. We've launched the game. It's out there. And then I was out of reception zone for the longest time. And so like when we cross the border, like, my cell plan doesn't work anymore. So, and the Wi-Fi on the train sucked. So I couldn't even like connect there. And so I arrived into Vancouver.
It's like Apollo 13, where they're like, there's like that window of time where they can't reach the astronauts.
Yeah, you have no idea what's happening. And so I arrive into the train platform, and I get there and I meet up with a friend of mine to go grab some lunch, like an early lunch or something. There's coffee or something, because it was still like morning. And so I get into the cafe and then go into the Wi-Fi, and I open Twitter, I open, the team chat, I open my inbox, and just, you know how Bandcamp sends you emails when you get a sale.
Oh yeah.
I just had this wall of sales emails in my inbox. I had people adding me on Twitter being like, this is so good. Like at this point, like the album had been out for maybe like a half an hour. Like no one even had a chance to like listen to the whole thing yet, but people were like, oh, this is so good. I just started playing the game. I got to like the third level. I was just like, well, it just came out, but it was this overwhelming response.
How are people finding it? That's always the big challenge for indies, is just how like we can make the best game literally ever made, and if people don't discover it, it's all for nothing. So what was driving the discovery of it?
It was Nintendo helped a lot, actually, because it was one of their sort of marquee indies that was coming out. So there was a lot of promotion from their end. It was one of the first like Switch indie games. Like it was around the like sort of launch window for their stuff, and we were also on everything. So like we were on every platform. Didn't matter where you were, you could go and buy it, download it, and stuff.
Right.
And then just a big Twitter presence, but then influencers and people with lots of followers started like noticing it and tweeting about it and stuff. So it just kind of almost went viral in a way of just people like saying, "Whoa, this game's out! You should check it out."
Still, I'm sure that what you just described is over the course of days and weeks. I mean, for there to be such a visceral reaction, in under an hour, it means that there had to have been a captive audience who had already kind of teed up and were ready and waiting.
Oh yeah, like we were definitely hyping it up. We definitely built up some degree of like following on the various platforms of just like, hey, it's going to come out today, and so we had those the folks ready to go, and yeah, just while I was up there in Vancouver for the launch, we were at the launch party and we're just like seeing all the response coming in, sales and everything, and it was just a really cool really cool celebration that really sort of catalyzed like our hard work for the game. And then so that's the first prong of the arc of my reaction to that. So it was like, first is like, I've never experienced anything like this in my life.
Were you overwhelmed? Like sometimes for people, it's actually very difficult because it feels like the world is suddenly very noisy and they're not used to being noticed. They're not used to, if I write something on Twitter, more than 4 people actually see it. It can be very, very intense.
Yeah.
Would you say that was a positive experience, or did you find yourself feeling kind of overwhelmed, I suppose I'll say again?
Yeah, definitely. Like I'm a very internal, introverted person. Like I have a hard time like being the point of focus for a large number of people, and so like for me it was very much like, oh God, everyone's looking at me now, sort of a moment, and especially with like because we didn't really have a lot of formal press set up, like PR stuff set up with the game, so there was no filter between people that wanted to talk to us and us. So I was just getting emails, not just from press people wanting to talk to me about the game, but then also from like labels and people that wanted to like work with me on something and all this stuff. And I was just like, I don't know how to handle all of this. And
what made you feel like, what turned the table on that then? How'd you grab the bull by the horns, as it were? Like, were you just in this state of shock for days or weeks, or did things calm down, or did you develop sort of a strategy for dealing with all of that?
I mostly just tried to, take it one thing at a time and just kind of, let it was a gradual process over the course of months of teaching myself that I didn't need to reply to everything.
You'll have to share your secret on that, because my inbox, I have such a hard time just like letting certain emails go. And I'm the worst, because sometimes I'll get an email from like, hi, I'm a university student at the University of Sydney and I'm working on my term paper about video game music. Yeah. Can I ask you some questions for purposes of my paper? And I'll write back to them 3 years later and I'm like, hey, you're probably like in a totally different part of your life now. But no. I just want to say I never deleted your email because I was hell-bent on writing back to you. And I'm sorry, I totally screwed up the ability to answer your question. I've done that so many times. I always feel horrible because I'm like, there's just so many, I don't know. It's so much healthier to probably just learn to be like, it's okay. And half the time these emails say, I probably won't hear from you, and I'm okay with that, and it's okay if you're too busy. They'll give me permission, and I still somehow have this, like, I don't know if it's ego of just like, no, I want to write back. I want to be the guy that did. Yeah. I have a hard time with it, so you'll have to become my spiritual advisor on this one.
It's difficult. It really is, because like if I if I did, but the thing is, like, I'm so easily distracted by things. Like, if I get in a mode of like, I need to reply to everything, I need to like focus on everything that's coming my way, I will basically just shut down and not do anything else. And so I really needed to discipline myself of just setting boundaries for myself and just letting, only certain things in, and, feeling okay, if I felt like a really personal connection to like someone reaching out to me, like, absolutely, like I would, I want to, reply and respond in a meaningful way. But like, it's been difficult, especially with like, like you said, like a lot of requests from folks that are just kind of want to get the boilerplate, same questions of how you got your start, etc., that kind of stuff. It's difficult to, always direct your attention towards those things. But that's also why, like, I do try to pick and choose like interviews and things that have a chance of existing on the internet in a prominent place, kind of I can put it on my profile or something, and just kind of like, here's, if you need basic information on something, like, it exists, like you can go find it. Like, I love, writing liner notes and things on Medium and stuff, and just kind of like creating content for people that are curious about what I do without having to specifically hear it from me directly every single time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the kind of stuff that you do with your videos on YouTube and all that stuff, like bringing people into your process, like, that those sorts of things, I think are really valuable, because they do kind of give that connection to the creator, of these compositions or whatever it is. Like, you're able to teach yourself by picking things apart through that assistance.
Yeah, I've also, it's funny because people message me and say, "Oh, you're so generous with your YouTube channel," and I it's very funny to me that would be the way it's framed, because I'm like, it says a lot about what your perception of the default state of a composer is, that you would consider that act generous, because it means that the assumption is we hold our cards very close to our chest.
Right.
I definitely can't let you know my trade secrets. It's like, did you know that you can put an F sharp over an E minor chord? This is some super insider shit. I know, right? Yeah, and so it's like the idea that I wouldn't just transparently share it. That's almost like this shock, because it's been very gratifying to have composers message and say, I put these scrolling sheet music videos on YouTube, and I get positive feedback from composers that are saying, this is just what I was looking for. Like, I went on YouTube, and half the time they're like, I never even heard of you before, and I just was looking for something like this of any kind of resource, and there's so little of it. And then it came across this, and it was so useful and helpful. Because for me, where it stems from is, and I get this similar, I know I'm not summarizing you, but I do think that this is probably something you would relate to or agree with, is so much of what motivates me is a general love of games, that my calculation is, if I can do something, if I can put things out there that offer up tools for other people to then go and make better game, like if a composer sees what I do and then they go and they take what I do and they built on it and they make something even better than I ever dreamed of with it, and it makes this new game that they're working on all the better, then games as a whole have benefited. And I, as a consumer, am super stoked, because the industry has just gotten better. There's now a better game out there for me to play that may in turn inspire me to push myself harder on my next project. It's like, to me, that attitude is so much what drives it. Where I'm like, it's ironically, you could even argue it's not generous, it's selfish. It's like, I'm hoping that maybe someone will kind of steal. It's not stealing. I'm offering this stuff up. Hopefully they'll take this and run with it and make something even better than I could hope to from it. And then we're all better off, It's like, I want to play that game.
Yeah.
And so, I remember noticing your blog. Remember you and Bear trading some mutual blog admiration on Twitter at one point, because he was always the same way, where he would put these like fucking theses on, it's like 50-page blogs.
On like 2 Qs,
it was unbelievably elaborate. And I remember thinking, who on earth is the audience for this? And then it turns out there's like legions of people who are deeply interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I should say, who other than me and a collection of similar, as a friend of mine would say, people who share my sickness would have an interest in this. It turns out it amazes me, especially gamers, even more than film nerds, because obviously Barrett's coming from a place of film and TV, pretty not exclusively, but overwhelmingly. And the average gamer seems to take an interest in the behind the scenes and the below the hood more than the average movie nerd. Like someone will play Celeste, and there's a much higher conversion rate of people who want to know about you. They want to actually buy the score and not just go like find it on YouTube, buy vinyls, all that kind of thing. It's truly incredible. And it seems like it's funny that you describe yourself as an introvert, and it's not that my impression was the opposite, but you have really, you seem very at home, especially on Twitter, sort of being open and communicative, and some people see social media as like, it's just where I share my links.
Right.
But to you, it feels like it's a little bit more of an extension of yourself. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, totally. I think that it definitely stems from like my background in, doing text-based role playing, online. Like, I'm still able to kind of channel
like that. Right.
channel myself into,
Are we all just NPCs to you, basically? Are we all just see every time you go on Twitter, it's just you like logging into your avatar, basically?
No, you're all other characters within this world of the internet. We're all collaborating on trying to communicate with each other. But but in a way, like, anything that you are putting a lens, on, you're putting yourself out there with a certain, perspective, of like, you can only present a certain part of yourself online in any sort of context, and so how you choose to present yourself, I think, makes a very strong impression. And, so I can at least channel my social qualities into how I present myself on Twitter, even though, in person, I'm just kind of over here just being like, oh God, there's so many people out there. There's so much like dialogue happening constantly. I'm just like, I'm going to tweet.
I've actually had the experience before of becoming aware of someone because of Twitter, where they're very vocal, they're very engaged, they're constantly responding to people. They're like 40 tweets down into these threads, and then you meet them in person, and they're so shy that it's almost difficult to carry on a normal conversation. And I don't mean that disparagingly. I just mean they find this tool that lets them really communicate effectively. That real in-person reactions are, I shouldn't say real, because they find a way to be real on Twitter that is genuine. A struggle for them in direct person-to-person communication. I've always, as much as Twitter is in so many ways the destructor of all things, it's like Zool that's bringing about the end of the world and Ghostbusters. At the same time, I do have a very positive. I've met lifelong friends because of Twitter. I've gotten work because of Twitter. Everything you're saying feels like I have analogs to that in my own life, and I still cling to a certain optimism that it adds a dimension to human life that there was no corollary to prior to this century, essentially, and that's a net positive eventually. Once I think my hope is that we're in kind of a birth pain right now of some people go on there and they make the mistake of not realizing that, you tweet it and it's there forever. So they say things, sometimes they just are really short-sighted. Sometimes they reveal a side of themselves that they don't realize how like they reveal horrible things about themselves. Like, I don't need to offer some summation of social media, but my hope is that our ability to kind of, use it as an extension of ourselves in an organic and productive way. We're still figuring that out. And I hope, and that as a result, is 30 years from now, it will be unquestionable net positive for humanity. Whereas right now I feel like we're kind of in this jury is out phase, and I'm just hoping for the best because I've had so many positive experiences, and I look at a story like yours and it seems awash in positive experiences, even if, while I'm sure there's also, you've had, I'm sure, your share of heinous toxicity as well. So
yes.
yeah, and it does, but it doesn't seem like that's stained it to the point of thinking of it as a net negative.
No.
But you tell me, I mean, is that the case?
Yeah, no, it is, I look at it kind of like it's another tool in how we are able to connect with people, in various ways. And I think ultimately the positive aspects of the internet, of this grand thing that is interconnectivity, I think ultimately is a net positive because we are so much closer to everyone around the world. Like, you look at things, of like being able to share stories, being able to share experiences and empathize with those things. It's, you see that all over the place. Like, someone realizing, oh, wow, like, my story is actually important and can resonate with someone that I have never met before. I think
can also give voice to a story that otherwise in a prior time would never even been. It's funny because so much has changed. But the question that comes up to me all the time is composers say, how important do I need to be super active on Twitter? You must get that question a lot, especially because your Twitter audience went from 0 to 1 million so fast. I mean, it was like the number of people interested in what you have to say and what you're sharing grew so quickly, and with good reason, obviously. And so you must get that question all the time of, is this something that I need? Like, is that the key? Is that the ingredient? Because not everybody resonates with this. And I loved the way you phrased it as, look, it's just yet another tool. Use it how it feels organic to you.
Yeah, and it's another thing that I've kind of felt all over the place, as I've become more visible on Twitter and all of that stuff of like, how do I use that visibility? And there's definitely days where I do just kind of want to hole up and just post links, that kind of stuff, especially if I'm like very out there and just kind of like I've been a very visible presence for a while, like, opens up the number of people that are seeking me out to say things, whether they're positive or negative. And, ultimately, like I kind of have to go away and come back, for a number of reasons. And I think letting myself take breaks when I need to lets me revisit that connectivity in a better light. But then ultimately, like I still want to be myself on there. Like I don't want to just be, uh, a repository of press releases. I just want to be a person. I want to share the games that I'm playing. I want to talk about just all the nerdy shit that I'm up to. Those sorts of things. And when I have opportunities to talk about the things that I've worked on that I'm excited about, like I know the people that are engaged in that social sphere are going to pay attention to that. Like I know that they'll actually care about it, even though I've been talking about all these variety of different subjects. I know that when I talk about Chicory coming out, people are going to be there and they're going to support that.
Well, I mean, I made the conscious. I follow a lot of science-y. My big love outside of music is science and cosmology and epistemology and just sort of the philosophy of kind of how do we, as Carl Sagan said, interrogate the universe.
Yeah.
And so I haven't been as active on it lately, I suppose, but especially in years past, I every now and again I would ask people on Twitter, why are you following me out of curiosity?
What brought you here?
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious why, what you like, if anything, and people notice. They would say, I came for the music and I stay for the science because I was always resharing articles of this geneticist just discovered this algae has a very peculiar property in this one particular lake that they realize they can leverage for a particular type of, a study of this one particular organism. And like, that's interesting to me. Or whatever, and I loved that. And so I thought, if I become a kind of curator of interesting little tidbits of just, hey, for those curious about where's the frontier of our knowledge as a civilization, not that I would claim to have my thumb fully on the pulse of that frontier, but I keep my eyes open, and I've become friendly with a few scientists who I think are literally living on that frontier.
Yeah.
And I love rebroadcasting that kind of thing. It's sort of positive knowledge. So that's very resonant. And hopefully something to think about for especially anyone listening down the road that's, where you and I were in 2006.
Yeah.
And asking themselves these questions, as it can be so overwhelming where, I have to work on my music. Oh, I have to go to GDC. Oh, I have to be tweeting. I have to this.
How do I build my brand?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, is that specific phrase actually brings to mind, how much do you care or think about that? Because again, just circling back to Chicory, for example, it's very you, but at the same time, it's not the same as Celeste. There are certain instruments and certain like synth textures where I'm like, she used that sound, or like that little harmonic movement, that chord change with that rhythmic sensibility. That's her voice. Like it's different instruments this time, and it's different tempo, and it's different. But I feel that familiar, unconscious decision-making process. Mm-hmm. At what point do you say, I really want to do something, like, I should say, how consciously do you think about that notion of brand, where knowing that Celeste means a lot to a lot of people, do you deliberately want to ping that a bit, or do you think, okay, I want to do something that no one would ever think to connect the dots to Celeste, or do you not think about this stuff at all?
I think it definitely, it affects it somewhat. Like one of kind of going all the way back to the question of my relationship with Celeste's popularity. One of the things that has very much affected it is video game fans tend to latch on to the concept of franchises a lot, I think, because it is a very large part of the industry and media in general. People love to have continuity and to have big media things.
The MCU is the ultimate proof of that, of all history.
Yeah. And, certainly takes a lot to compete with that. But the thing for I think a lot of fans is like, people loved Celeste so much that they were just like, we want more, we want, you did Celeste, so the next thing you do is going to be more Celeste, right? And so like, there's this very like understandable reaction of, wanting Celeste 2 or, more DLC. And like, we did, a DLC, we did a new chapter, but within that chapter, like, I was very cognizant about not wanting to just sound like, here's some more Celeste levels. I wanted it to still be its, a new thing within the same context. And so, I did kind of branch out a lot when I was writing that. I brought in string players. I brought in more than just, my massive synth patches and my piano, like I brought in a whole bunch of extra stuff in there. And, so I was like afraid, like, is this what people want? Like, but I'm going to give them something that hopefully, fills this need for more Celeste without being just the same stuff. And, it turns out people responded really well to it. They really loved, sort of a fresh take on that kind of thing. But then
you're kind of meeting them halfway.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's literal Celeste DLC. So like, to the extent that they want more Celeste, they are getting that in a very literal way. So it kind of buys you space to push the music a little further, which is actually a wonderfully advantageous position to be in, I would think.
Yeah, and so that was definitely a good chance to kind of revisit my relationship with the game and like the fans' desire to have more of that very specific sound. And then in kind of moving on from that, I guess Chicory was kind of the first big project that I started on after the Celeste DLC, and I definitely made a conscious decision when we were starting that up that I wanted to have like 90% of the instrumentation be like actual instruments, like not just synths.
Right.
Like I wanted to score for more live recorded instruments. I wanted to score for sampled instruments, whatever it was. Like I really wanted to kind of build an ensemble of, of core instruments that felt alive and kind of within this space without having to like fall back on some of the stuff that resonated really well with people in Celeste, but then still going to those places when I felt like it was right, for stylistic reasons and all of that. But it definitely was a conscious decision to kind of try and do something in a new box while still keeping some of the old tools around.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a perfect description. I mean, it sounds like you were sort of deliberately trying to do the thing that you ended up doing, because that's basically, I wouldn't be able to describe it more accurately than that. So I guess it leaves me, as we rapidly approach the 2.5 hour mark, and I'm very grateful for your generous time. There's just a million little gems scattered throughout this, I think.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Obviously, there's the new one, Earthblade. Is that what it's called?
Earthblade, yeah, that's the new EXOK Celeste team game.
So we obviously heard in the reveal sort of announcement trailer a taste of what you're doing there. But I'm curious, maybe related to that or not, knowing that you migrated away from the kind of overwhelmingly electronic feel of Celeste to this far more acoustic, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, chicory sound.
Yeah.
And not that Celeste is rigorously, it's not, the thing that I loved about Celeste was it doesn't feel like, oh, it's just yet another chiptune sort of throwback. Right. Like my goal is to be as authentically 1987 as possible. It really did things that would never have been possible then, while also leveraging some things that were, familiar. And it was wonderfully delicious. It was new. It was interesting. It was new, even while trafficking in some things that were not new. But then Chicory is wholly different from that, from a sonic palette standpoint. My question is, bearing all that in mind, are those dots that are forming a line? Are you intentionally going somewhere? Does every project just come at you and you think, let's just see where this takes me? Do you have some white whale of a type of thing that you would be the dream to sink your teeth into? I mean, what's kind of if you could write your future, do you know what that would look like?
I think honestly, the future for me, like, I want to, be able to keep writing the kinds of music that I'm writing, but also have more and more budget to realize it as best as it can be, if that makes sense. Where, like,
most certainly does.
Yeah, because I love one of my favorite scores from last year, and I'll keep yelling about it to the ends of the earth, was the score to Paper Mario: The Origami King.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those situations where the music teams at Nintendo have been writing a very different, very varied series of soundtracks, but they've been writing a very specific kind of music over the course of the Paper Mario series, over the course of the Mario franchise, as well as Zelda and everything.
Oh yeah, it's very recognizable.
all of these games, like, they really have this kind of tradition of being kind of a little out there in terms of their instrumentation choices, their approach to composition and everything, and presenting that in a game. And I feel like Origami King really sort of captured the essence of what a really good Nintendo soundtrack is like, with all of the budget thrown at it, so that every single instrument is recorded live. It's all of these eclectic ensembles. It's not just, symphonic stuff. It's,
Right, sure. Oh, yeah.
this collection of very specific instruments. You've got like a full like big band jazz thing going on. You've got like all of these ensembles that are kind of doing their amazing. They get all these amazing Japanese session musicians together. Like the latest Mario Kart was also an amazing example of that too, of just getting all of these session musicians together and creating these ensembles that don't exist. Like there's not a band that is these instruments, but they've collected them together to make these very specific pieces. And that's the kind of the passion that drives me. I love seeing inventiveness in instrument choice, in incorporation of synthetic sounds with live sounds, with sampled things. They're not afraid to go into the past and bring out like an NES or a Super Nintendo sampled something to kind of present it in the context of something else. Like I just love that inventiveness, and I just want to keep on embracing that for future soundtracks.
That sounds like specifically an inventiveness of instrumentation that like in a sort of increasing the roster of collaborative musicians that you're cooking up music with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, God knows I relate to that. Of all the things you could have said, that one probably strikes closer to home than almost any answer you could give, because I really relate to that. To me, finding talented musicians that like I write for this particular cellist a lot, and people say, I get asked about it periodically, and I say, she's just such a force of nature. Or Kristen is a perfect example as well. Like, I get excited to hear what she'll do with something. So I think of I don't sit down on a project and go, oh, what would be great? English horn would be great. And how convenient, I know Kristen. I say, where can Kristen fit in? What can she bring to this? Like, I go actively looking, this could be a really nice place for something very breathy. And then I'll call her and say, okay, of your 7,000 instruments, what's the most wispy and breathy choice? Like, are we talking bansuri and so it's like, it's totally backwards from the way sometimes I'll work, where I think of a color and then I go looking for somebody who can play it.
Right.
So I think, I don't know. That's not exactly the same thing that you said, but I feel like they're kind of cousins of each other, and I totally
they're definitely related. Yeah, I just love finding those connections with musicians and collaborating with them to create really cool pieces. That can work in all kinds of contexts, whether it's just standalone pieces, dynamic stuff, whatever it is. Yeah. I like to experiment.
I love it. Well, given the popularity of your music, especially amongst like the kind of remix and cover crowd, the number of musicians at your fingertips, I suspect, is not lacking. So I love it. Well, this has, it's funny because what I love is discovering over the last 2.5 hours how much I didn't know about you, and I know we haven't had occasion to get to know each other ultra closely compared to with some of the other folks I've chatted on here with. But I didn't know more than I realized. I mean, logically, of course, I would have assumed there's a lot I don't know, but there's wonderful highlight things that I would have assumed I came across at some point that I just somehow didn't. And it's genuinely inspiring. I absolutely think that the arc, the kind of specific roadmap that your career has had is so unique amongst composers and so informative there is no one size fits all. There is no take two of these and call me in the morning that works for everybody kind of strategy.
Yeah.
And the way that your path has specifically informed who you are and the way it's kind of forged the composer that I'm talking to now is just so very inspiring and interesting and unique. And it's a story that's truly your own. So I hope you'll continue to make things. Obviously, you're going to keep writing scores, I would assume. But things like, just knowing that you've dabbled in design so much and your esque project, ESC. What do you call it? Is it which of those?
Escape,
Yeah, well, fair enough. I thought I was being cool and all like inside baseball to call it by its presented name, but yes, Escape. Hopefully, you'll find time to keep those fires burning as well, because there's not a lot of other folks who are kind of actively creating in that corner as well as the music corner.
Yeah, it's all about just finding the time for it, letting myself take less on so I can do my own stuff at some point.
We should totally do a GDC talk about that very subject.
Hey, wow, you're right.
Yeah. An ominous portent of things to come. Well, Lena, thank you so very much for this. This has been truly, truly awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll do part 2 again soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.